Now, without further ado, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This looks like a loud crowd, so thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Los Angeles Times and Skylight Books for sponsoring this event, David Horsey for moderating it, and Larry Ingrassia for that very generous introduction. Now, Larry got most of it right, except he thought I was going to talk for only 30 minutes. He doesn't. Obviously, he is not familiar with the United States Senate. Takes 30 minutes to clear your throat, then you're off and going. But thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a wonderful turnout. And let me also, while I'm here in LA, thank all of you and people throughout this great state for supporting my campaign for president. Together, we took on virtually the entire Democratic establishment, and we ended up getting about 46% of the vote and received over 2.3 million votes. And Jane and I enjoyed the campaign in California just enormously. What we understood is that the campaign in this state, nobody has enough money to do a whole lot of media. And what we had to do is simply go up and down the state. We ended up holding a zillion rallies, bringing out about 250,000 people in those rallies. And some of those rallies were just spectacular here in LA and San Francisco, but in many of the rural areas of the state. We were able to look out at crowds of young people, black and white and Latino and Asian America and Native Americans, and we saw the potential of this country, the greatness of this country, the beauty of this country in its people. So California, thank you so much for your support. And while I'm here, I figured I would say a few words about the book as well. Why not? Some of you bought it. I think it's a good book. It's sold about 250,000 copies so far. But while I'm here, I thought some of you may be a little bit interested in what's going on in Washington and around the country. So let me say a few words about that before we get into the book, and then David and I will chat for a while. As some of you may be aware, we had an election in November. And sadly and tragically, Donald Trump won the Electoral College and became our president. But what we should not forget is he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. And what that means, in my view, is that Donald Trump has a mandate for nothing. But on top of that, and maybe more importantly, on almost, not every, but almost every major issue facing our country, the positions advocated by President Trump are in a minority and often in a distinct minority. Poll after poll shows us that when it comes to questions like, should we repeal the Affordable Care Act, the American people overwhelmingly say no. What they say is improve the Affordable Care Act. Don't throw 20 million people off of the health insurance they recently acquired. And I think many of us believe that while we got to fight to prevent the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, our goal is to join the rest of the industrialized world, guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege. And I know that there are a number of wonderful organizations in this state, including National Nurses United, who are fighting for a single-payer Medicare for all healthcare system. But it is not just Trump's view on repealing the Affordable Care Act and leaving millions of people out there hanging with nothing, but on issues like minimum wage, his view is a minority. Issues like pay equity for women, his views are a minority. Issues like Trump going before the American people and saying climate change is a hoax, that is a distinctly minority position. Overwhelming majority of the American people know that climate change is real and that we have got to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. On issues like immigration, again, not my view, but the views of the American people. The people want us to move forward with comprehensive immigration reform, not continuing to beat up on undocumented people in this country. So my point is, on those issues and many more, Trump's views and the views of the Republican leadership in Congress are in a minority position. Now, the question then arises, which is a fair question, is how did Mr. Trump end up winning the election? And I think, given the fact that he was the most unpopular candidate for president since polling has existed, and is today, as I understand it, the most unpopular president in his first month in office. How did he win the election? Now, let me be very honest with you. And the answer is, there are a lot of reasons. But the major issue is not, I think, that Trump won the election so much as that the Democratic Party lost the election. And to my mind, that speaks to the need for a fundamental transformation of the Democratic Party, opening the doors of that party to the energy of millions of working people and young people who want to get in and transform this country, making it a party less dependent on big money interest, more dependent on small donations. So it is important when we talk about politics today, is not just looking at the White House. We understand that Trump won the White House, but we also have got to understand that despite their extreme right-wing agenda, which is way out of touch with where the American people are, an agenda which says that they're going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, repeal the Affordable Care Act, and then give huge tax breaks, and I mean huge, hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1%. That is not an agenda the American people support. And yet, not only did they win the White House, they now control the U.S. Senate, they control the U.S. House of Representatives, they control about 2/3 of the governor's chairs throughout this country. In the last 8 years, Democrats have lost some 900 legislative seats in states from one end of this country to the other. When you have a failed record like that, it is time to reappraise where the Democratic Party is and how it can move forward in a new direction. And by the way, just in passing, literally a week from yesterday, there is going to be an election in Atlanta for a new chair of the DNC, and I hope you will do everything that you can to help elect Keith Ellison as the next chair. Keith understands, Keith is a congressman from Minnesota, he understands, as I do, that what we need to do is create a grassroots party, that we need millions of people in that party having the courage to take on the billionaire class and mobilize the American people to stand up and fight back in a way that we have not seen in the recent history of this country. And I think ultimately what the Democratic Party is going to have to do is make a very simple but enormously important decision. And that takes us back to the old folk song of Woody Guthrie about which side are you on? And the truth of the matter is, then and now, you cannot be on the side of Wall Street or the drug companies or the insurance companies or corporate America and then go out to working people and say, I am on your side. It doesn't work that way. But then let me touch on some of the reasons that I think Trump won. And that is what Democrats were doing during the campaign, which was honest and true, is they were saying to the American people, look, compared to where we were 8 years ago when George W. Bush left office, we have made significant progress. All of you remember that when Bush left office, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. When Bush left office, we were running up the largest deficit in the history of this country, $1.4 trillion. When Bush left office, the world's financial system was on the verge of collapse as a result of the fiasco on Wall Street. That was the reality. And what Democrats were saying, truthfully so, is the economy today is a hell of a lot better than it was then. But, while that reality is true, there is another reality that most Democrats did not talk about. And that other truth is that despite general gains in the economy, the fact of the matter is that for the last 40 years, not Obama, not Bush, not Clinton, way back, for the last 40 years, the great middle class of this country has been disappearing, and we have seen massive levels of income and wealth inequality. The truth of the matter is that over the last 25 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth. You know, our Republican friends often get very, very nervous when we talk about redistribution of wealth. But I want everybody here to know there has been a massive redistribution of wealth over the last 25 years. Problem is, it's gone in the wrong direction. We are talking about trillions of dollars that have gone from the middle class, trillions of dollars in wealth, to the top 1/10 of 1%. And what Trump was able to seize upon in a totally hypocritical way, because I don't believe he believes this at all, but what he was able to do is seize upon the anxiety and the pain that millions of Americans are feeling today and that Democrats and the media have largely ignored. The truth of the matter is that while we are better off today than we were 8 years ago, the other truth is that millions of people in this country are working longer hours for lower wages. The truth of the matter is that millions of working class and middle class people are scared to death, are worried to their core about what will happen to their children and their grandchildren. Will their kids ever be able to get a home of their own? Will their kids ever be able to have a decent paying job? Will their kids ever be able to pay off the outrageous level of student debt that they are carrying? Those are fears that people from one end of this country have. And those are issues that Democrats have not talked about enough. And I want you to put yourself in the place of a 50-year-old man or a woman who has worked in a factory for 20 or 30 years. Maybe they had a union. Maybe they were earning decent wages, decent health care. And suddenly one day, their employer announces that those jobs are leaving this country. They're going to Mexico and China. And those workers understand that when you're 50 or 55, you are never again going to have a job that pays you those kinds of wages. How do those millions of workers who lost jobs because of a disastrous trade policy feel? They are apprehensive and they are angry. How do workers feel? I've seen this in my own state. It has existed all over this country. And this is what Trump picked up upon. There are workers in this country who are forced to train workers for other countries on how to do the jobs they are doing. Think about the helplessness, the pain. It's like teaching somebody to put a noose around your neck. Think about how workers feel when their jobs go abroad or when their company says, sorry, we're going to lower your wages or lower your health care benefits, while at the same time, the CEOs receive tens and tens of millions of dollars in compensation. I remember, never forget, in Vermont a number of years ago, suddenly my phone lines in the office were bouncing off the hook from people who worked at the IBM plant in Vermont. And these people, many of them had worked there for decades. They were promised a pension, a defined benefit pension. They knew exactly what it was going to be. And suddenly, on a given day, IBM tells them and workers, all their employees all over the country, that they were changing the rules of the game, doing away with that pension plan and replacing it with something much weaker. Meanwhile, at exactly that time, the guy, his name was Lou Gerstner, was head of IBM, left the company with a $200 million golden parachute. Now, we organized effectively, and we ended up beating back IBM's effort. And they didn't cut those pensions. I'll give you another example, and there are a million examples. Some of you may have heard about what's going on with Courier in Indiana. Courier is owned by a company called United Technologies. United Technologies felt that it was important so that they can make some more money to throw workers in Indiana out on the street, move to Monterrey, Mexico, where they're going to pay people $3 an hour. Several years ago, the CEO of United Technologies got a golden parachute of $171 million. My point is not just to talk about corporate excesses and greed, but to put yourself in the hearts and the souls of millions of people who feel angry and helpless and left behind by the global economy and by corporate greed. Put yourself in the place of a worker for General Electric, one of the largest corporations in this country, and you got a chairman 20 years ago named Jack Welch, Neutron Jack. Jack Welch said that if he had his druthers, he would place manufacturing plants on barges so that he could go to the cheapest labor in the entire world. And he left General Electric with a $400 million golden parachute. So this is the anxiety and the anger and the frustration that Trump was picking apart. Put yourselves in the position of a single mother making $30,000, $40,000 a year, desperately looking for decent quality child care for her child, but unable to find anything decent for less than $15,000 a year when you're making $40,000 a year. Put yourself in the place of workers right here in LA or in San Francisco, where you cannot find affordable housing, where $12,000, $15,000 are not going to do it. Put yourself in the place of workers in southern West Virginia. And in southern West Virginia, we are seeing a phenomenon that has not been seen ever in this country. You all know that as a result of improved public health and healthcare and medical breakthroughs, people today live longer lives than our parents. We live longer than our parents live longer than their parents, and so forth. Today, for the first time in the modern history of the United States, we have millions of working class people whose life expectancy is lower than their parents. In West Virginia, in Kentucky, in many parts of our country. And the reason that people are dying young is they're getting addicted to opiates and to heroin. They are drinking much too much and becoming ill with liver illnesses, and they are committing suicide. What we are seeing in parts of this country is a level of despair and hopelessness that we have not seen in the modern history of our country. It's an issue that is virtually not talked about in the media and certainly within political discourse. And in the middle of all of that comes a phony billionaire who says, I hear your pain, and I'm going to do something about it. Donald Trump, I'm going to take on the Republican establishment. I'm going to take on the Democratic establishment. I'm going to take on the media establishment, because finally you're going to have a champion who is going to stand for you. Now, the truth is, of course, that Trump was lying. He never believed a word of it. But millions of people in their desperation, in their pain, said, look, I think this guy may be a phony. I don't believe him. But you know what? We got to shake up the system because the status quo is not working. And they voted for Donald Trump. Now, let me touch upon some elements of what I call Trumpism that we have seen in the last month. And this is very, very serious stuff, because now we're not in a campaign anymore. We're not in campaign rhetoric. We are in policy making. And what Trump is clearly doing is setting a whole new set of rules. And he's playing with a very different playbook than any president in modern history has ever done. And these are some of the characteristics of what I call Trumpism. First of all, to be a successful demagogue, what you need to do is foster hatred and division. You need to divide our people up, especially against minorities. And clearly, as you all know, during his campaign and since, the cornerstone of his efforts have been bigotry and intolerance and rallying people to dislike blacks, Latinos, Muslims, and other minorities. Let us not forget, when we think about Donald Trump, that when he got involved in politics a few years ago, before he became a candidate for president, he was the leader of the racist birther movement, which tried to delegitimize the presidency of Barack Obama, the first African-American president in our history. This was not an effort to disagree with Obama, to dislike Obama. What he was really saying is, this black guy really should not be president because he was not born in the United States of America. I don't have to tell anybody here about his campaign attacks against the Latino community, calling Mexicans rapists and criminals. I don't have to tell you about his attacks on the Muslim community, and I don't have to tell you about his sexist attitude with regard to women and the horrific things that he has said and done. So you have a president, what most presidents, even conservative presidents, like George W. Bush, who I disagreed with on everything, all right? But Bush played within the rules, in a sense, of what a president does. And what a president tries to do is bring people together. Bring people together. We now have a president who is working overtime, trying to divide us up, trying to get a majority to take out all of their angst and pain on a minority. This is a very, very dangerous development. Second of all, again, uniquely, I'm a member of the United States Senate. No senator, no politician I know is scrupulous about telling the truth all the time. Whether they are progressives or conservatives, everybody stretches it a little bit, try to make your case or beat up on the other guy. This is politics as usual. But in Donald Trump, we have something that is very, very different. And I say this with no pleasure. My wife dislikes me saying this. But the truth is that Trump is a pathological liar. Now, and by that I mean, and it is not my style. If you know me well, I don't go around viciously attacking people. I don't do it. Never ran a negative ad in my life. I don't do that. But you got a guy now of which one or two things is accurate. Either he knows that he is lying, or even more dangerously, he does not know that he is lying. Not funny. I wish I could tell you it was funny, but it's not. Because when he says in the beginning of his campaign that he saw on television with his own eyes Muslims in New Jersey on a rooftop celebrating, joyous about the destruction of the Twin Towers on 9/11. He saw it with his own eyes. And I don't think, as of today, that he has recanted that. Problem is, nobody else in America saw that on TV. It wasn't on TV. They check it out high and low. Everything was on TV. It never appeared on TV because it wasn't true. So what do you make of somebody who goes before the American people? I saw it, and it wasn't like, gee, I was in a back room and I saw something. I know you weren't there. You won't believe it. This is what I saw. That's not what he said. He saw it on TV. And you can figure that one out. And then when he says, with nobody agreeing with him, that he would have won the popular votes, if it weren't for 3 to 5 million illegals voting in the election. All right, we can laugh about it because nobody believes it is true. It is delusional. Nobody believes it is true. Republican election officials don't believe it is true. Nobody believes it's true. But that is what he has said, and he has repeated it. So you have a president, and this causes massive problems for media. Because what do you do with a guy who literally lies all of the time? And then we get to the media. Now, if you read my book, we got a whole chapter on the corporate media. I am not a great fan of the corporate media. But my criticism is when you have a media in this country owned and controlled by a handful of conglomerates, you got a problem. And you have a media which, for its own reasons, does not focus attention on the real issues facing the American people. And I remember when I was campaigning here in California, I was followed around by 12, 15 media. And we went to a community which was impacted by fracking. We went there with the express purpose of hoping to get some national attention on the crisis of fracking. Virtually nothing written. We went to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, to the Native American reservation there, where life expectancy in Pine Ridge is the equivalent of Guatemala, a poor third world country, where unemployment is rampant, where youth suicide is far too high. We went to the Bronx in New York City to point out that you have elderly people living in these high-rise projects who can't get out of their homes and go shopping because the elevators don't work and there are rodents all over the place because they need billions of dollars in order to rebuild and repair those buildings. So we try to focus attention, but it doesn't work. Corporate media is not necessarily interested in those issues. But that is a very different critique than what Trump is saying. What Trump is saying is that everything that you see on CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, the Los Angeles Times, everything is a lie. It is all fake news. And then this leads you. Now think about it for a second. If you're an ordinary person out there, and you're not really much into politics, you got the President of the United States telling you that everything you see and hear and read, it's all a lie. And this leads you inexorably to where Lamar Smith, who is a Republican congressman from Texas, what he said recently. And this is where that attack on media leads you to. This is what Congressman Lamar Smith of Texas said recently. Quote, "Better to get the news directly from the president. In fact, it may be the only way to get the unvarnished truth." End of quote. All right. But you understand what this is about. What this is about is saying everything is a lie. The only person who will protect you, the only person who tells you the truth is the President of the United States. Then we have, and here is where the hypocrisy and the lies become laughable if they weren't so painful. Trump went around the country saying to the American people, he says, "I'm a different type of Republican." He says, "I know the Republicans out there, Paul Ryan, all these guys, they want to cut your Social Security. They want to cut your Medicare. They want to cut your Medicaid. Not me. I will not cut your Social Security, your Medicare, and your Medicaid." Well, obviously, that's a lie. And we're seeing that right now because the people he has appointed to important positions in health and human services, in the Office of Management, in budget, in other important issues, their whole careers have been based on a desire to make savage cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And I have said over and over again, and let me say it again, to the President, you can save the Congress a whole lot of work if you tweet it out tomorrow, because we're now a government by tweet, if you tweeted out tomorrow to tell Congress that they shouldn't go forward with cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid because you're going to veto that legislation. But that's a tweet you will never see because it was based on a total lie. So what you have seen also is Trump during the campaign. And again, this is redefining American politics. He says, hey, I'm a Republican. I know all these billionaires, but I'm going to take on Wall Street. You know, I know that Wall Street has been doing terrible, terrible things. I'm going to take them on. I'm going to drain the swamp. Well, it is a funny way to be draining the swamp when you bring in all of the swamp characters into your administration. This guy literally had photos of the leadership of Goldman Sachs on his ads about all of the things that he was going to do, taking on that establishment. And yet the president of Goldman Sachs, a guy named Gary Cohn, who recently left Goldman Sachs with a $250 million severance package, is now Trump's key and chief financial advisor. And he has, of course, Mr. Mnuchin, also from Goldman Sachs, is now Secretary of the Treasury. So imagine the hypocrisy of telling people around this country you're going to take on Wall Street and then appointing half of Wall Street to your cabinets. The other thing that we should be very mindful about Trump is that each and every one of these issues is enormously consequential. When Trump talks about 3 to 5 million illegals voting in the last election, he knows what he is doing. And what he is doing is sending a signal to every Republican governor and every Republican legislature in this country to accelerate their efforts in voter suppression. So what you have is a political party, not just Trump, who understand that they will lose many elections around the country if people were able to participate in free, fair, and open elections. So what they have done since the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 decision, gutted the Civil Rights Act, what they are doing now over time is making it harder for poor people, for people of color, for young people, for older people to participate in the political process. And then on top of that, if you think that Citizens United is a disaster, this is what they have in mind to follow Citizens United. Citizens United, again by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision 7 years ago, says that a billionaire or a corporation can spend as much money as they want on independent expenditures. In other words, you have the right to spend zillions of dollars on TV ads, radio ads, etc., but you cannot communicate, at least theoretically, with the candidate. What they are now moving toward is going beyond Citizens United and doing away with all limits on campaign finance, which will mean that the Koch brothers will not only be able to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on campaign ads, they will be able directly to give money to a candidate. So if somebody wants to run for the U.S. Senate or governor from your large state, from California, they are able to say, will be able to say, if this thing happens, here is a check for $500 million. We will supply you with your campaign manager, your speechwriter, your media consultants. You essentially are an employee of the Koch brothers or some other group of billionaires. So what these guys are doing now, working overtime, is trying to undermine democracy through voter suppression, through maintaining Citizens United, and even going further, and also by extreme gerrymandering, such that in the last election, Democrats won more votes for congressional races than did Republicans, but yet Republicans dominate the Congress because of this kind of gerrymandering. So a major assault on our democracy is also taking place. Now, I say all of those things not to get you totally depressed, but to make it as clear as I can that we are looking at a totally new political world, and that if we play by the old rules, we will lose and they will win. Our job is not to play by the old rules. All right, our job in a million different ways, and we should feel good about the fact that we have the majority of the people on issue after issue on our side, but in a million different ways, whether it is resisting in every way possible these disastrous immigration ideas that we are hearing about, the deportation of many of our brothers and sisters, whether it is about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, etc. And you are beginning to see that resistance rise up. All of you were aware, and some of you participated on that fantastic Women's March last month. Millions of Americans and people all over the world came out. I was in Montpelier, Vermont, our state capital. I never saw anything like it. They literally had to shut down the interstate because they couldn't get more cars into Montpelier. And that was taking place all over the country. So our job is to be very, very smart. We can defeat Trump and Trumpism and the Republican right-wing ideology. But what we have got to understand is that despair and throwing up your hands, that ain't an option. That we have got to be involved in the political process, and by that I do not mean only elections. It does mean elections, but it means more than elections. We are the majority of the people in this country. And when we stand together, not only can we effectively turn back Trump's right-wing agenda, we can advance a progressive agenda. And it is very important that we do that. We cannot always be on the defensive. Our job is to put them on the defensive. Let them tell working people in West Virginia and Kentucky why they should be satisfied with a $7.25 minimum wage rather than a $15 minimum wage. Let them tell women why they should be satisfied earning 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. Let them tell young people why they should be forced to leave school deeply in debt rather than making public colleges and universities tuition-free. Let them explain to the American people why we remain the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right. Let them explain why Donald Trump and other billionaires do not pay a nickel in federal taxes. So we have got a lot of work on our hands. We've got to be creative, and we are already seeing some of that uprising taking place. You are now seeing Republicans doing town meetings, and suddenly they are beginning to meet some of their constituents. And I should mention to you, just next Saturday, the 25th, there are going to be rallies all over this country, hundreds of rallies, telling the Republican leadership, you are not going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. You're not going to throw 20 million people off of health insurance. You're not going to do away with the protections regarding pre-existing conditions. So what I am seeing and what I believe can happen if we are smart is not only defeating Trump's agenda, but creating a progressive movement in this country, which is going to create a government that represents all of us and not just the 1%. Thank you all very much.
Senator, thank you for inviting me to your rally.
But you know what, David? I forgot to mention the book. There's a book here too, but we'll get to that later.
There is a book, indeed. Well, thank you for coming to LA. Thank you for being with this audience tonight. And the Los Angeles Times is very happy to sponsor this, and I'm excited to be here for a conversation with you for a few minutes. So I want to start kind of in a funny way. If we can put up an image on the screen. Yeah, this is, I don't know if you can see that, Bernie, but this is a cartoon I did during the primary, and you were there saying, the big corporations didn't want us to have seat belts, so you kids put them on. So that's my best Larry David impression, actually. And one, actually got a couple more here. Next one, and this one is touching on the phenomenon of all the millennials who fell in love with you. I guess you can all read that.
Well, let me just say a word on that. So you thought you were going to get a chance to ask me questions. No, you're not. No. But to me, the most inspiring aspect of the campaign was not just the 13+ million votes that we got. We won, I believe, in every state, a significant majority of people under 40 years of age. And the significance of that is that our ideas are the future of this country. And don't ever forget that.
So there's one more image I want to put up, and this actually leads to an actual question for you. So here it is. This is this is a column I wrote about a month ago, and Senator, it says, President Sanders, Bernie would have beaten Trump. Now, I figured these folks would like that. There are quite a few people who thought I was a total idiot. People who voted for Trump and people who voted for Hillary Clinton. But for me, it was just doing the math. Just analyzing the election. You could argue it came down to the votes of a few thousand white working class voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. My theory was that given your appeal among those folks, that you would have peeled off enough of those voters to switch those states and thereby win the Electoral College. So
Let me answer. The answer is nobody knows. You know, that's the truth.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that we did very well, not just with white workers, but with black workers and Latino workers and Asian American workers and Native American workers. And I think we did especially well in many of the states that Trump ended up winning by a few votes. So, who knows? But, I think there's a good chance we...
Well, I wanted to ask you something about that, though, because I'm sure you thought about it. And the one response I got from some people, smart people, saying, I understand that math, but if Bernie Sanders had been the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party and all the right-wing media would have hammered you on the socialism issue. They would have portrayed you as Karl Marx incarnate. And I'm a Cold War kid, to use Billy Joel's phrase. I remember how potent that used to be. Do you think that, I mean, again, it's hard to, this is all speculation, but some people are convinced, no matter how much they liked you, that you would have been crushed by that.
Well, the answer is, as you've indicated, nobody knows. But on the other hand, I think what we could have done is created an excitement and a vision which would have resulted in a very, very large voter turnout, with millions of working people and young people who otherwise might not have voted in the Clinton-Trump election coming out, and us winning a lot of those votes. But again, look, the issue is, I'm not much into political speculation. I think we have very difficult times in front of us right now. Trump is the president, and our job is to educate and organize and effectively defeat that horrific agenda. That's where we are right now.
Well, I wanted to talk about that. I've been around long enough. I've seen a lot of elections come and go. People win, people lose. In 1980, Democrats and progressives were not too happy with the result. In 2000, they were pretty upset about the result with an election that was decided by the Supreme Court. But I've never seen the reaction among progressives and Democrats that I've seen talking to people in the wake of this election. The disbelief, the despair, the people feeling almost as if someone is having the same reaction as if someone in their family died. I mean, it's pervasive. I suspect most of the people in this audience have felt that. You wake up in the morning and it's a phenomenon unlike any I've ever seen. And it comes from the sense that this is out of the ordinary. This is different. And it's not just progressives and Democrats who are thinking this way. There are plenty of Republicans who are trying to figure out, what does this all mean? I mean, David Frum, formerly of the Bush administration, wrote a piece in Atlantic recently analyzing the possibility, if not the likelihood, of some sort of authoritarian regime. Senator McCain, John McCain, has said he's not as worried about that as he is about the long-lasting effects of division in the country that may come out of this. So, why don't you just, no. Is this your usual crowd? Okay, that's what I thought.
No, actually, this is a very calm and sedate crowd. Usually they're kind of raucous. But.
Well, so you talked a lot about this, what to look ahead of, the difficulties. But how? I guess here's my question: how bad can it be? I mean, are these people capable of actually authoritarian regime, or are they? Is it somewhere short of that? I mean, what do we have to look forward to?
The answer is, he's been president for less than a month. We don't know. But these are some very dangerous people who are around him. And also, there are unanswered questions about his campaign's relationship to Russia. We certainly know that Russia played a very, very powerful role in the campaign. What we don't know, and what is being investigated as we speak, and I don't know the answer to it, whether there was any active relationship between the Trump campaign itself and the Russians' coordination. That we don't know, but that's going to be looked at. But what you clearly do have around Trump, in people like Mr. Bannon and others, is a very dangerous world view, which has a lot to do with seeing, I fear, perpetual warfare, wars of civilization, in this case against Muslims, racial divides with Latinos in Mexico, a attitude toward women, which one would have believed in the year 2017 had long been passed. So this is not George W. Bush. This is, in fact, a very different type of divisive politics, a politics which is surrounded by Wall Street and much of corporate America, which is trying to divide us up, which is attacking the media in a way that we have never seen, which, as I mentioned, is actively involved in voter suppression so that they can win elections by denying people the right to vote. Does this worry me? You're damn right it worries me. Is this a movement toward authoritarian government? Yeah, I think it is. But I think our job is to understand that when these conditions arise, we arise too. We stand up. So if Trump is playing with a new set of rules, we play with a new set of rules.
Well, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you described Trump as a pathological liar. And you know, when you look at, you know, in every election brings consequences. There's a ebb and flow in politics. There are a lot of issues that you can lose on and then 4 years later come back on. But this war on facts seems to be something beyond what we've seen before. And I have a quote from Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone. He says, Donald Trump is proving, yeah, let's hear it from Matt. Donald Trump is proving that if you connect with America's anger and paranoia, you can get by quite easily without facts. So far, it's worked pretty darn well.
Well, it worked in the campaign. I'm not quite sure how well it is working right now. I think there are people who voted for Trump, by the way, who are uncomfortable with a number of the things that he is doing, his constant attacks on media, the fact that he said that he would take on Wall Street and he has hired half of Wall Street, the fact that he said he wouldn't cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and he intends to do just that. So I think you are seeing a whole lot of people looking at this guy and saying, that's not what I voted for. But here is the political point to be made. Trump understands that he is not going to be winning here in California. And he's not going to be winning in New York State, and he's not going to be winning in Vermont and many other states. That is not his worry. Where he is spending his time and energy, where he is focusing his attention, are on those battleground states. And what our job is, there is a reason that next Saturday I will be in Kansas. And after that, I'll be in Mississippi. Because we have got to make it clear to working families and the middle class that this guy is not standing with them. That beating up on Latino workers who make $10 an hour is not going to solve your problem if you can't afford to send your kid to college and you can't afford health care. So we got to understand who our enemies are and have the courage to stand together and take them on, not let Trump divide us up. That is something that many of us are going to be working very, very hard on.
Well, you were, in your book, you mentioned you were at the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, and I was actually there myself. And I spent some time with a veteran civil rights activist, Bob Zellner. And Bob talked about, he has this vision of the South changing, of switching. He believes, already there is a huge black vote. There's a growing Latino vote. And he said the key is white working class people. I think you would agree with that.
Well,
but
the issue is twofold. The issue is, and I just met with, I don't know how many of you know the Reverend William Barber of North Carolina. Reverend Barber has done an extraordinary job in grassroots activism in North Carolina, where he is taking on a very reactionary and vicious Republican Party. But he has brought forth, just I think 2 weeks ago, he had 80,000 people, black and white, in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he's been doing this with his Moral Mondays for several years now. So the answer is, number one, yeah, it is an issue of white working class people in the South, but it is also making sure that we end this voter suppression so that African Americans and young people can actively participate in our politics.
How, though, if your target is to reach some of the working class folks who have, for generations, actually stretching back before the Civil War, been told basically their social position is better than the black folk, so they've participated for generations in keeping themselves in place by keeping other people in place, and in a situation where facts are malleable and most of the radio programs they may talk to are telling them a whole different view of the world. How do you deal
David,
with that? How do you shift the reality is what I'm trying to say.
Well, first of all, we can't talk about them. That's who I am. My father was a working class person. I'm a working class family. It's not them, it's me. It's the vast majority of people. Sometimes, my wife's father was a taxi cab driver. So, this is not them, it is us. And it is what we need to do is create an agenda that works for all people, whether you're white or black or Latino or Asian American or whatever. And that's in a sense what the book is about. I didn't get into it, but what it is about is in a economy which is clearly rigged, where the rich get richer and almost everybody else gets poorer. What the Trumps of the world are doing is say, yeah, that's the reality, but your problem is you got somebody picking strawberries here in California. That's your enemy. And if we throw that guy out of the country, suddenly your life is going to be better. All right? And our job is to tell that worker who's making $10 an hour that the strawberry pickers are not their enemies, that Wall Street and corporate America are the people who are ripping them off. And this is where I think the Democrats, getting back to a point I made a few minutes ago, have not been strong. All right? It is a disgrace that Donald Trump talked more about Wall Street and talk more about a disastrous trade policy than most Democrats do.
Well, the first time I saw you was at the running of the heifers in Brattleboro, Vermont. You talk about this in your book. My daughter went to school at the School for International Training in Brattleboro, so I was back there for that. And she came away with that, a confirmed progressive, staunch activist. And she's told me she has had sort of mixed feelings about the outpouring of activism now, because she's thinking, where where were all these people before Trump? And has Trump, in a weird way, been the best thing that could happen to the progressive movement?
No, Trump is a disaster for this country. Nothing best thing about him. But I think to answer your question, and again, we are going to have to be very, very, very smart, and the outcome is not clear. It could go either way. But if we are smart, the answer to your question can be yes, in the sense that the American people will look out at this time and say, my God, what have we done? And we are going to have to figure out how we work together and not allow racism and sexism and homophobia to divide us up. But also what we are going to have to do, and in this sense, the corporate media is not of any help, all right? We are going to have to take on the 1% and the billionaire class. Their greed, you know, the truth is, it is the greed of this billionaire class. Can you imagine people like the Koch brothers worth $80 billion, one family, who are working day and night to try to privatize or destroy Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. People on Wall Street, billionaires, trying to get more tax breaks for the top 0.2% when we have kids in our schools who are hungry and don't have adequate nutrition or educational opportunities. There is, and Pope Francis talks about this as well, it's not just an economic crisis, it is a moral crisis. You know, and I was just thinking about this. I was just thinking about this today from a moral perspective. Just think about this. The attack against undocumented people in this country, and not a few of them are here in California, is that they came into this country illegally, which is true. They came in illegally in order to try to find a better life for themselves and their children. That's what they did. And now you have Trump and right-wing Republicans who are making them the enemy, who are trying to destroy those families, put fear into their hearts, okay? Meanwhile, when you talk about illegal behavior, you got crooks on Wall Street who destroyed this economy. Millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, and their life savings. And the president of Goldman Sachs, one of those financial institutions, an institution that paid a $5 billion fine for illegal behavior, is now Trump's major chief financial advisor. So we have to redefine what we mean. And we need to create a moral sense in this country that understands that poor working people who came to this country out of desperation and sometimes driven to this country by disastrous trade policies which destroyed their agricultural background in Mexico, they are not our enemies. And we have got to stand with them, with working people, come together to win this fight.
Well, okay. I have to say this is the most unusual conversation I've ever had. So, now, how you put together a campaign that was really a phenomenon in political history of the U.S. How organizationally, how does that continue? Are you engaged? Are you engaged in congressional races, in legislative races, or? Well,
what happened
in the 34th congressional district in yes.
What happened during the campaign, as you indicate, is that a lot of energy, I think pent-up energy, and a lot of beauty came to the fore, and people looked around them, and they said, it is time for us to think big, not small. It is time for us to have a vision of where this country can actually go in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of climate, in terms of the environment, in terms of women's rights and gay rights and so forth. And what we wanted to do is, with all of that energy, we did not want to see it dissipate. So what happened is, out of that came an organization called ÄúOur Revolution. Now, I am not, legally as a United States Senator, I cannot be involved in it, and I'm not. But what has happened is we have some really great people who have already been active here in California, by the way. A lot of people have gotten involved in the Democratic Party here and done a great job, winning a lot of seats in the Democratic committees. And it's happening all over this country. So to answer your question, the answer is yes. And what we are seeing now is a lot of grassroots activism. We are seeing a lot of people who never before thought that they would be interested in running for city council or running for legislature, now starting to run for office. But not only that, right here in California, I was very proud to work with a coalition of folks taking on the pharmaceutical industry on Proposition 61. So it's not just, political campaigns and electing candidates. It is also initiatives and ballot items. That same type of concept is going to go to Ohio, where we're going to try to take on the pharmaceutical industry there. So the answer to your question is yes. What we wanted to do is to make sure that the energy of the campaign stayed alive and that people continue to be involved in the political process.
And apparently people would like to know about the 34th. This is former Congressman Becerra's district. Are you involved in that particular
race? We're looking at a lot of propositions right now. Arturo is a good friend of ours.
Okay.
He helped me during the campaign, and he and I just chatted tonight, so we'll see where we go with that.
Okay. Now, how important do you think, we just saw a pretty dramatic confrontation between a state attorney general in Washington and the Trump administration, which the states won. How important do you think the involvement of states from California to across the country is going to be in
Well, what the Attorney General in Washington did, joined by other attorneys general, said is that what Trump was proposing was unconstitutional. And it was a violation of separation of powers and so forth. And, I think the appellate court has agreed with them. So I think, especially under Trump, that we have got to use all of the resources that we have. And here in a progressive state like California, that means thinking through these things at the state level, at the local level, of ways that we effectively fight back. New York State, other states the same way. We got to fight we got to be smart and tactical, but fight with every tool that we have. And California, I have the feeling, is going to play a very important role in that. But it's not just, it's not just immigration reform or the ban on Muslims visiting this country. It is enormous issues like climate change. What I worry about very much is that if we are going to transform our energy system, it cannot just be the United States. The United States has got to lead the world, working with China and Russia and India and other major countries. And when you have a president who tells the world that he thinks climate change is a hoax, who appoints the head of Exxon as his Secretary of State, and who appoints a guy who is beyond bad as head of the EPA, Mr. Pruitt, this not only is bad for our country, it sends a signal to the rest of the world. Well, because the Republicans have 52 votes. That's how it happens. And, some of us fought it as hard as we possibly can and dragged it out as long as we could. But the issue here is that states like California and New York and Vermont have got to tell the world that Mr. Trump, notwithstanding, climate change is very real. It is causing devastating problems to this state, this country, and the entire world. And with or without Trump, we're going to have to go forward and transform our energy system.
So, Senator, I wanted to challenge you on one thing. I was in Bakersfield when you were there during the primary, and you were in a meeting with a group of Latino activists and farm workers, and they brought up their concerns, their experience with the groundwater being polluted by fracking, by
pesticides.
Yeah, and in talking about that, you said the corporate media will not talk about this, or will not. And something struck me about that, and that was that the LA Times had done a series of what turned out to be award-winning stories about that very thing. And so my question is, in the criticism or the critique of corporate media, it strikes me it's a little bit like me having said what I said about working class people in the South. You can get a little broad.
Yes.
I think there is a huge difference between elements of the media.
Yes, there are. And let me just say this. And we've got a whole chapter in the book on just this issue.
I read it.
Okay. And here is what my concern was. And I remember this distinctly being here in California. For example, the way it is when you run for president, they have what they call embedded journalists following you around. So you have all the networks and everybody else, and they go following you around to your events. We did a press conference, can't remember where it was in California, with doctors and nurses talking about the need for a Medicare for all single-payer system. And you had a room full of journalists, to the best of my knowledge, there may have been an exception or two, but almost not a word of it got into the paper. What media is primarily, in my experience, interested in is what we call political gossip. All right, in other words, well, the latest poll, you cannot believe, and the book talks about it, before I had made a decision to run for president, are you going to run? When are you going to run? How are you going to announce? And then after we lost here in June, when we decided to stay in the race, because I wanted to negotiate with Secretary Clinton a strong progressive agenda. Every day, the talk, when are you going to drop out of the race? How much money are you raising? What about the latest polls? All of this stuff which nobody cares about. And yet, we could not get coverage on we had Robert Reich. Many of you know Robert Reich, right? Talking about income and wealth inequality. My point is I do know, of course I know, that the LA Times, the New York Times, every week there are going to be some great articles in there. But I will also say that one of the reasons that Trump wins is that there are millions of people out there whose pain is not reflected in television or in the newspapers. Their lives are not reflected. And I think, and then, if I may, from a personal point of view, I ended up with 46% of the popular vote. There are many, many dozens of newspapers, of statewide newspapers all over this country. David, you know how many newspapers endorsed my candidacy?
One, the Seattle Times.
You got it. You read the book. That was your test. All right. So, is there a media establishment? Of course there is. Is it owned by large, wealthy corporate interests? Yes, it is. Does that mean to say that there are not great articles that appear in the LA Times or the Washington Post every week? There are. But on the other hand, I would argue absolutely and positively that on television and in the corporate media, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the fact that real unemployment is double what official unemployment is, the host of issues that impact working class people are not effectively displayed in the corporate media. That's my view.
I think there is perhaps a structural problem with political coverage somehow exists in a different realm. I know my newspaper does a lot of coverage of immigrant issues and anyway, covers a gamut of homelessness, but somehow it doesn't get into, I think you're right, in the political coverage tends to be driven by television and tends to be who's up, who's down.
David, I've been in politics for a few years. Do I look that old? Okay. Not one reporter, and I've dealt with a zillion reporters. Not one reporter has ever come up to me and said, Bernie, we got 43 million people living in poverty in America, and what the hell are you going to do to eliminate poverty in America? No reporter has ever come up to me, this is the truth, and I'm surrounded in Washington, they got 5 political gossip sheets there. You're surrounded by reporters every day. Not one of them has ever said, Bernie, 52% of all new income generated today goes to the top 1%. What's your program to deal with that? In other words, those are not the framework, not the issues. They don't come from a working class perspective. The issue is, what do you think about this senator doing this and doing that, and what's going to happen 5 years from now? In other words, again, the perspective of corporate media is not that of working families, in my view.
So what are you going to do to eliminate poverty in America?
All right, so you broke the rule. I'll tell you what we're going to do. All right, we're going to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. We're going to create millions of decent paying jobs by rebuilding our infrastructure. We're going to invest in our schools and make public colleges and universities tuition free. And we're going to get that money by taxing Wall Street and billionaires. Thanks for asking the question.
All right. And to do that, you need the power to do it. In 2018, only 8 Republican senators are going to be up for election. They seem to be from states that are very likely to re-elect them. It's going to be a bit of a long slog to get to the point where anyone can start enacting those sort of things.
Well, the answer is yes and no. What you're saying is true, but there's another truth out there. And I see this moment in history, I look at it not just as the coming elections, and the point you made is true. It's going to be tough for Democrats to make gains. I look at it in a way that we looked at the growth of the trade union movement in this country, the way that we looked at the civil rights movement in this country when you and I were a little bit younger, and millions of people, black and white, came together to say that we're going to end segregation in this country, we're going to pass a Voting Rights Act, we're going to do our best to eliminate racism. I look at this moment as where we were 100 years ago when women demanded the end of women being second-class citizens in this country and the right to vote and the progress that has made. I look at it the way we look at the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. In other words, don't look at this moment just as important as this is. Believe me, I work in the Senate, this is important. But it is not just inside the Beltway politics. It has got to be a moment of mass mobilization where millions of people tell the Congress that the status quo is not acceptable, that we need real change in this country.
All right. Well, actually, I like the. There are structural things that have to be dealt with. For one, if I remember the numbers, there were 25 million more votes cast for all the Democratic senators than for Republican senators.
Not 25 million, but there were more. But
2.5. Anyway, it was a significant number.
Much lower.
250 million. I don't know. It was a lot. But we do have structural things like the Electoral College that worked maybe 200 years ago, but perhaps aren't working in a different society.
Right. That is absolutely. Look, at the end of the day, as I began my remarks by saying Donald Trump lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. That is a lot of votes. But he is president. That picture does not make a lot of sense in a democracy. Yeah, that's right. So that's an issue that we got to look at. You know, your right to vote, the right you have to vote is not even enshrined, really, in the Constitution or in federal law. It is state law, and some states are making it very hard for certain people to vote. That is a structural issue. Gerrymandering is an issue that we have got to deal with, part of the point that you made. So yes, there are a lot of structural issues that we have to deal with.
Well, we're... unfortunately, it's... Okay, sorry, but I'm sorry. We can't just sort of have a free-for-all here. As much as I'd love to, or the senator might.
Let me just.
Yeah.
The questions are.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Look. Let me reiterate just a few points, and I say this. These are not alternative facts; they are facts. And the facts are on almost, not every, but on almost every major issue, whether it's economic, whether it's environmental, whether it's women's issues, we are the majority of the people. And that means we have got to figure out something. I can't, you know, there's no one, trust me, nobody has a blueprint. It means to say, here you are the largest state in the country. You are the wealthiest state in this country. You have enormous resources. You have a number of undocumented people who may be targeted by Donald Trump. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to protect those people? How are you going? Wait a minute, shouting out is not the answer, okay? This has to be thought about. You got city councils. You got a state government. How does California, your large state and my small state, and other states come together to make an offer to Mr. Trump that he cannot refuse to listen to? It's not asking, it's telling. But that is hard. That is hard stuff. But what I will tell you is at the end of the day, when millions of people, this is the civil rights movement, when millions of people stood up and say racism and segregation is no longer acceptable, the people led and the leaders followed. And that's where we are right now. So I'm not going to give you a prescription. You know more about your state than I do. But there are ways. If we have the people and we have the people power, I believe we can win this thing if we are smart. But think out of the box. It's not just elections. Elections are enormously important. Elect the most progressive people that you can. Join us in going to the Republican districts and demanding to know why they want to repeal the ACA. But it is not just that. It is forming movements so that Trump has got to say, God, I can't take on all of these people. We're going to have to retreat. That's what real politics is about. All right, David, I think we're going to end it up. Let me just say this. First of all, I didn't mention the book, but it's a good book. You should read it. But second of all, now is not, if there's ever a moment in history where we do not have the luxury of saying, you know, I'm burnt out, I'm exhausted, I'm tired. This is not that moment. And I know that every day we pick up the Los Angeles Times or other papers and we see things that drive us nuts and upset us very, very much. But I want you all to remember, and I don't mean to be a history teacher here, but I want you to think that this is not the first moment in history, in American history, that has been bleak. Be an African American in Mississippi in 1950. Be a young woman 100 years ago who wanted to get an education but was denied that right. Be a worker in a factory who had absolutely no rights because you didn't have a union. Be a gay person who could not openly express your sexuality. All right? And on all of these issues and many more, you know, people could have given up. During the campaign, Jane and I went to Birmingham, Alabama. We just campaigned there. And we sat down and we met with a bunch of almost all African-American local leaders. And what I learned then, I don't know if you knew this, I didn't know it. You know, many of you know about the terrible bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 beautiful children. You all remember that horror, that act of terrorism? What you probably didn't know, I did not know until I learned it, that in Birmingham, Alabama, in that month, when those children were killed, there were 14 bombings in that one city. In other words, the city was under siege by terrorists who were local government officials. That's what people experienced. They did not give up. They stood up, they fought back. Some died, some went to jail. And this is a moment, and if there's anything that I learned in this campaign, and I learned it in your beautiful state, and I mean that seriously, because as David mentioned, we were in Bakersfield, we were all over the state. You got great people of all backgrounds, okay? And what I learned from the bottom of my heart, this is not just political bullshit, is that when you go out there and you have the opportunity that I had, and that is to speak, literally speak, to, I can't remember, I think over 2 million, I don't remember how many, just a whole lot of people, and hundreds of thousands of people in your own state, you see an incredible level of beauty. You see a younger generation that uniquely, more than any generation in American history, is the least bigoted generation in the history of this country. So I left the campaign more overwhelmed and impressed by the beauty in our country. And don't let Trump and his friends on television discourage you. There is incredible beauty in this country. There are millions of people of every race and every background who want to work together to make this the country you and I know that we can become. And right now, what our job is to be as smart as we can be, to be as effective as we can be, to organize. I can't tell you how to do it in your state. You know your state better. But organize, educate, get involved in the process in a way you never have before. Because this is not just for you. This is for my 4 kids and your children. It is for my 7 grandchildren and your grandchildren that you have now or to come. This is for the future of the planet. That's what we're fighting for. So with that, let me thank David, and let me thank the Los Angeles Times for sponsoring this, and thank you all very, very much.
Bernie Sanders.